Greetings, greenhouse people. I'm your host, Bill Calkins, and in an effort to provide this critical information in any way you choose to consume it, we are pleased to offer this discussion in video and podcast formats. My guest today is Dr. Will Healy, definitely one of my favorite guests to have on these Tech on Demand videos. Will is a retired technical manager who spent decades with Ball Seed as an advisor to greenhouses around the world. If it's happened in a greenhouse, Will has seen it. This time, he's here to share protocols for finishing African marigolds as part of our Tech on Demand series covering crop culture for key annuals and perennials. From media selection and nutrition to water, light, temperature, pest and disease control, and a whole lot more, finishing crops requires careful attention to avoid losses. If you like this installment, be sure to subscribe to the Tech on Demand podcast on your favorite app and find dozens, maybe hundreds of Tech on Demand videos on the Ball Seed YouTube channel. Will, welcome back to Tech on Demand. I know you like to talk about marigolds. We also have a video on French marigolds that I put a link to in the show notes, but we're talking African marigolds today. So why don't you go ahead and jump in and tell us why this crop is important and what growers can do to grow it to their best potential.
Well, Bill, I'm glad we're going to talk about marigolds separate, French versus African, because, it's kind of like talking about apples and oranges. Yeah, they're both fruits, but they're really not the same. There's so many things that are different. Even if you wanted to say a closer comparison might be oranges and grapefruit. They're both considered citrus, but beyond that, they're totally different. And so what we really need to think about is how are African marigolds different from your regular old French marigolds, and how do we be successful with this? Because this is one of those crops I think a lot of growers shy away from because they're kind of a hassle. They're a little bit more work, but they are a higher price point. They're by consumers really enjoy them tremendously. They're a great fall filler. So if you're looking for something for the summer and fall period, especially as you get into Day of the Dead, this is a really great product to produce, and it's not very hard if you follow the rules, but this one does have a lot of rules. So let's talk a little bit about some of the ins and the outs about this and how to be successful. One of the first things that we have to remember, and if we listen to the French marigold presentation, you probably saw this slide and you've probably experienced it with the French marigolds, but this is an even greater problem with your African marigolds. You've got to plant them immediately upon arrival. The reason is that you need to get some fertilizer into them so that you can get those bottom leaves to fill out so you can get a nice full bushy plant. When you don't get them planted right away, what ends up happening is you just basically they don't fill out and you end up with that old stick in the pot look, which is definitely not something that we're happy with. Another thing that if you do long-term holding of those plugs, because a lot of times what people will struggle with is they look at the marigolds and from the top, French and African look about the same, even though they're not. And they'll basically wait to plant them because they're not being, if you're doing it in the spring, they're not necessarily going into packs. They're probably going into pots, and you're going to plant the pots later so that they sit around. And if they sit around, they get root bound. And when they get that root bound condition where the roots are basically totally encircling the soil ball, they just don't root out well. And this is really a problem when you want to size this up. Whereas your French marigolds are short and runty little things. If you've got them 6 inches or so, you're probably pretty good shape. Whereas a good African marigold, 9, 12 inches or more, depending upon the pot size and the display that you're trying to get with it, is really critical. And so to get that size, you got to get them planted and get them growing so that they are fed well. You also want to avoid incorrect watering while you're holding them, so where they do this root wrapping. Root wrapping is not a song, Bill. It's not a bunch of guitars. It's roots going around in a circle. And as you see in this picture, the plants on the left, this is where it's wrapping. Why it's wrapping is because they're just tinkling water onto the top. They're putting a little bit of water, and roots are kind of like teenagers. Anyone knows that has teenagers know that they tend to sit around waiting for something to happen. And if you feed them potato chips and sodas, they're happy, right? They'll just sit on the couch and just lay flat. And that's what you've got here is these, if we like to think of them as adolescent, lazy teenager roots that aren't going down, they're just going around in circles, laying horizontal. And of course, that's the problem is once they start going around in circles, they're not going to go out into the soil ball that you're planting them into. So you want to make sure that when you do water them, if you're not transplanting them immediately, and even when you do, is that you dry them down to a level 2, and you water them up to a level 4 so that you basically force the roots to go down into the pot looking for water, because they will actually head for water if you can. Once they start root wrapping like this, you've got problems. Also, these will stretch a lot, whereas French marigolds, yeah, you can kind of have them under temperatures and they kind of won't stretch. And even if they double in size, they're still small, right? But when these start stretching, the African marigolds, when they start stretching, now you've got problems. So you really want to make sure that you don't have conditions too wet, high diff, and we'll talk more about that, in the holdings where they get really tall. Now, the nice thing about these is that if they are stretched, just plant them deeper. Plant them so that you basically have that tuft of leaves sitting right at the surface. Because one of the things about marigolds is they will form stem roots rapidly when they have a little moisture, as you'll see later. They will form it, and so that you can bury them a little bit deeper, and then they will root out better and be a little stronger. You don't want them to be stretched when you plant them. That's just looking for trouble later on, because you'll never produce a nice quality plant. Marigolds, both French and African, have these kind of interesting thing where they get these black spots and people go, oh, that's a disease. No, that's not a disease. What that is iron toxicity. Those are just little cells that basically have accumulated excess amounts of iron. And of course they say, well, where's that iron coming from? Well, African marigolds are more susceptible to this problem than French marigolds. So if you've got a little bit of problem with the French, you really are going to have problems with the African. What's happening is that the phosphorus is deficient or way too low. And as you have phosphorus deficiency occurring, the plant is looking for phosphorus. And what it does is it sends out acidic solutions into the soil ball off the end of the roots to basically free up the bound phosphorus that's on the soil. This is basically what happens in its native habitat. And as we know, you can take a plant out of the country, but you can't take the country out of the plant. So in its native habitat, it's grown in soils that are very deficient in phosphorus, or the phosphorus is bound. And so to release that phosphorus, what happens is it basically acidifies the soil, and then the phosphorus released and the plant is a happy plant. Unfortunately, in our planting them in sphagnum peats and different peat mosses, what happens is then, because there's no buffering in it or inadequate buffering, it basically drops the pH. And when the pH drops, iron becomes rapidly available, and then basically the plants take up the iron and you get these spots. So when you start seeing spots, you've got yourself a definite problem. One of the challenges we have with African marigolds, which is very different than French marigolds, African marigolds have a much longer crop time. Most soils have a charge that's good for about 8 to 10 weeks. And then at that point, they assume that the water quality will have enough alkalinity, bicarbonate in it, to keep the pH up, and that tends to buffer the soil. Whereas if you are using pond water, or if you're using low alkalinity water, you've got very pure water, and you're trying to grow African marigolds, you're probably going to see more of this problem, especially late in the crop, because you get to about 8 to 10 weeks old, and suddenly the limestone charge is gone, and the plant is still needing phosphorus, and so it's basically pumping out acids, and it's going to then try to take up the phosphorus, and then the iron basically becomes into the plant, and you start ending up with all these spots on it, and the plant quality goes down. So really monitoring the pH on this is really going to be important as you go through the crop cycle. If we take a look at the plug trays in the picture on the right here, it shows extreme examples of low phosphorus. These plants were grown on the cool side, but the plants on the left were fed with 15015, and the plants on the right were fed with a phosphorus containing 17.5, 17, 13.2, 13, any number of different fertilizers that have a little phosphorus in them. And as you can see, you put a little phosphorus on it and all of the problems suddenly disappear. And of course, the spotting is not there. So I'm kind of spending a lot of time talking about this because when people don't grow marigolds, they say, well, I can't get a quality plant. Well, a lot of times it all goes back to this specific problem where they didn't monitor the pH, they didn't put on phosphorus, and they ended up with iron toxicity, which of course then makes the crop unsaleable. So that's probably the biggest problem that we see with this particular crop. For example, when you're going to go and plant, we want to make sure that we plant fertilized plugs. The reason for that is that the feed needs to be where the plug roots are. And of course, if you go and you think about it, when you take the plug and you put it into a pot and you fertilize it, there's enough leaf canopy that it sheds all the fertilizer off into the soil around it, and there's no fertilizer where the roots are. And as you know, Bill, you can't get fertilizer taken up unless the fertilizer is where the roots are. The roots take it up. So we want to make sure that we fertilize where the roots are. So immediately before planting, get that 200 parts per million fertilizer on. Now, for example, 20-10-20, in this case, it's a green care formulation. The phosphorus has 43 parts per million phosphorus in it, and that's at 200 parts per million. So we want to make sure that we're actually doing that. And the iron is okay, manganese is okay, all the other nutrients micronutrients are fine. Now, if you can't plant them right away, so sometimes you have to hold them because of just the volume that you're trying to transplant, you may want to wait and at that point add 300 parts per million. Now, why do we add 300? Well, not only do you get more nitrogen because you've had 3 days where you probably just put water on them, clear water, and you've leached any fertilizer out, but also because it gives you a little bit bigger shot of phosphorus, because at 200 parts per million, you have 43 parts per million of phosphorus. If you have 300 parts per million of nitrogen, you have 50% more nitrogen and 50% more phosphorus. So if we basically have 43 plus 50% more is about 63, 64 parts per million phosphorus. So you're getting a good shot of phosphorus to make sure that the roots and the plant has adequate phosphorus so that you don't run into this problem in the early part of the crop. If by chance you have to hold them for longer than 7 days, sometimes the pots don't show up. Sometimes there's too much transplant. Sometimes it just doesn't happen. So if you have to wait more than 7 days, you want to make sure that you're fertilizing with 50 to 75 parts per million on a weekly basis at minimum to prevent any fertilizer stress, and then add 200 parts per million at planting. Now, 50 parts per million, you have to remember, is 1/4 the amount of 200 parts per million. So you've got 1/4 as many parts per million nitrogen, and you have 1/4 of the parts per million of phosphorus. So therefore, you're only putting on 10 parts per million because 43 divided by 4 is 10-ish, 10, 11 parts per million. So you're putting in only about 10 parts per million if you're using 20-10-20. And so therefore, you really need to kind of jack it back up just before transplanting with the 200 parts per million. Now, remember, when you're using 20-10-20, you are putting on a fair amount of phosphorus and ammonia, which will cause and promote stretch. So you need to be aware of that, especially early in the season. Later in the season, under high light conditions, if you're doing it during the summer, it might not be as much of a problem. But during the really early plantings, you may want to be thinking about, we need to get a growth regulator on fairly rapidly so that they don't stretch on us. But as you'll see later, this pre-plant fertilization may be a big boost and maybe the most you need to put on to get the plants to do what you need them to do. Normally, we use a wide range of containers. If you're using cell packs, you really want to use a fairly low count, like an 1801. Using a higher count, like say a 30 or a 36 count tray, there you're going to really need to put the growth regulator on to keep them under control. A lot of growers will use different size containers, especially for summer and fall production, so that you can basically get some good sized plants to get that really cool look. Remember, these do have a much longer crop time. Normally we'll be looking at somewhere between 1 to 2 weeks longer than if you were use smaller pack sizes, and then basically larger containers. So you start running into plants that are out there 7, 8 weeks, especially late in the season. And that's partially it's due to the issue of flower induction. One of the problems that we run into every year is where the shelf life of the plant is impacted by the fact that they didn't get watered. And if we start tracing back to what caused that, why was it? It's usually because the grower has used a soil where the bulking filler agent that's used with the peat. So, for example, use 50% peat and then you use 50% of, say, a wood fiber in there. You basically have a soil that has a very abrupt drying out. It stays wet, and bam, it dries out. And unfortunately, at retail, that just doesn't work because they're not going to be spending the time watering them as diligently as you would in the greenhouse environment. So we really want to make sure that you don't go above 30% of bulking filler material in that, just so that you have good shelf life of that plant for the consumer, because it's really, you're not growing these for yourself, because you can grow great plants in just about anything. You really want to be growing great plants that consumers can be successful with. And this is one of those that you really want to make sure that it doesn't dry out too fast for the consumer, who then feels like it was wasted money. So making sure that you've got that peat in there to hold the water so that the crop looks good and stays good. Also is absolutely positively essential you test that soil, especially for African marigolds. Remember, I mentioned that this is a low pH sensitive crop. pH drops down, you get all the iron uptake, you get all the spotting, and the quality of the plant goes down. It just is a death spiral. So make sure that your pH, starting pH, the time you put that plant in there, in that pot, is between 6 and 6.5, and that you do have some EC in there so that the plants will actually grow. More of a problem later in the season, where you're not really maybe paying the same level of attention to as you would early in the season, or if you're trying to do, say, pansies, which of course like a lower pH, at the same time you're trying to do these, which have a higher pH requirement, and you're trying to manage all this together. So kind of know where you're standing, and then you can react differently as needed. So if you are doing late season and you have soil that the pH is low, say starting out at 5 or less, 5.5, you want to check it again 1 week later. And if it hasn't come up to 6.5, you probably want to get in there with a dolomitic limestone, liquid lime kind of treatment to them, so that you can make sure that the root system is not negatively impacted by that low pH with the iron issue that we know about. So really kind of test that soil both before you plant and then about mid-crop, so that you're sure that you're staying on track. If it does start to drop, you want to top dress if necessary with dolomitic limestone or calcium carbonate, not calcium hydroxide, not hydrated lime. Hydrated lime basically does not give you the same response as either calcium carbonate, which is just regular lime, or dolomitic limestone, which is a little bit better. One of the problems that we run into is the issue of old soil. This is soil that you've saved from last year that you just haven't used, or soil that you bought early in the winter period and you're now going to use it late in the fall, where the starting charge and or wetting agent is gone. The plants in the yellow box were plants that were planted at the same time from the same plug block as the plants that on the right. The difference is that the soil that was used in the plants that were in this block were from soil that was old, that had basically the wetting agent was gone, the starter charge was gone, the limestone charge was gone, and as you can see, the plants are significantly reduced. Every year we run into this, and people go, well, what's the problem? And you kind of start noodling around and find out what's going on, and sure enough, they'd use old soil, because that's about the only way you can do this. Let's just talk about the moisture and fertilization program to give you the high quality plant that you want. Remember, consumers are buying the top. They look at the top of the plant and say, ah, awesome. But growers are producing the root system, because if you have roots, you can make the plant dance. If you don't have the roots, it's really hard to do much of anything. And what we're trying to do is we're using the fertilizer to give us the foliage and the flowers, and we're trying to use moisture to control the roots. And so let's first of all talk about moisture management, because that's really key to getting a good solid root system underneath that plant that you can then make it do what you want it to do. Remember, fish grow in water, roots grow in air. So if you have totally saturated roots with water, they're just not going to grow well. Whereas the roots really need that wet and dry cycling to get good, strong, fibrous root systems to take up nutrients. One of the things that you have to remember about marigolds is they're highly responsive to moisture. If you keep them continuously wet, notice the soil has kind of a little bit of a green cast to it. See all that? And that's not the plants, that's just algae growing on there. What they'll do is they'll start forming these stem roots. If you see these stem roots forming, that's just like alarms and bells going off all over the place saying you're too wet. You're keeping this way, way, way too wet. And of course, you've got very soft growth, you've got stretch growth, you're going to have all kinds of problems, so that you really want to make sure that you're not keeping them too wet and you're getting these aerial roots. If you keep them too dry, they tend to be a little bit stunted, especially with African marigolds, where you need a little bit of stretch on them. You really don't want to dry them down too far down to level 1. You don't want them to wilt, because you're going to basically end up with stunted runt plants with premature flowering, which is, of course, a bad plan. One of the things that we like to see growers do when they actually plant the plugs is basically use some type of nozzles that are at an angle to force water into the crop, into this root ball, and force soil down around. If you just water straight down, what happens is there's enough leaf canopy that it basically umbrellas the water around the plant, and you don't force that water in and around the root ball. So if you air gap it, so there's air between the root ball and the soil in the pot, they just don't root out, or they root out very unevenly or very slowly. Remember that with moisture management, especially now that a lot of these would be grown, the African marigolds are grown in pots, you don't want to just pour water on them so that the pot is totally saturated. That's a bad plan, because you end up with a perched water table underneath. You remember that plug is probably about an inch deep. So when you first water the plants in, you want to water them in so that you get enough water down just below the plug so that it roots out and then starts rooting down. And basically what you want to do is after you brought the plants in, is just put enough water on it so you get enough water right down into the upper surface, so that you basically end up with a level 4 maybe at the very top, which will then drain down and slowly move down so that it then dries to a level 2. So as you can see at their different water levels, some of your best root growth is between level 2 and level 3. So this is why we go from level 4 down to level 2. And that way we get it wet enough, and then we get them dry enough. If you're not familiar with the level 1 through 5 watering and how you can manage that, there is a webinar and podcast for you to use to train your grower staff and to remind them on an annual basis, because we forget stuff on what is the appropriate level to irrigate them. Let's talk about the fertilization, especially the feed at pre-plant. Now, this is an example with begonias, but I've done this with just about every crop that we grow, and we see the exact same response. So I'm really comfortable that this is the way to go if you're serious about having highest quality plants, especially if you want plants with roots, with leaves at the bottom of the plant sitting right at the top of the soil. Because what happens is if you feed them late, all the big leaves are at the top, nothing at the bottom, because they're starving at the bottom. So what we want to do is we do a pre-plant. This is some work that Bill Argo did a number of years ago, where he didn't feed the plants. So there's no feed at transplant. They did a pre-plant, at transplant, they fed them. They fed them at pre-plant and again at day 14, or they fed them at pre-plant plus day 7 and day 14, and then a pre-plant plus at day 0. So they planted them, pre-plant, feed, planted them, fed them, day 7, and then again day 14. And as you can see, as far as filling the plant out, there really isn't that much difference between just doing a single pre-plant or feeding it multiple times. So the take-home message here is if you get that feed in as a pre-plant, is there really a lot of need for later on? You can basically, if you need to feed later on, you use that to kind of custom to the artistic part of growing, which is to size the plant up, to color it up, to feed it, to get it to do what you want. So you don't have to be putting too much feed, because one of the problems, especially with African marigolds, is the more you feed them, the bigger they get. The bigger they get, the more growth regulator you have to put on. The more growth regulator you have to put on, then you just run into this death spiral of working too hard. And growing shouldn't be that difficult. So let's really watch the feed, especially when we're using a fertilizer that has a lot of phosphorus and a lot of ammonia. When you have to put the phosphorus on because of this iron little issue, the phosphorus requirement, and consequently they usually use ammonia to put it on. So you base it in the formulation. So therefore, to get the phosphorus, you're going to have to put the ammonia. So putting on too much fertilizer does get you into trouble. Here's a good example of what happens when they don't fertilize them early at pre-plant versus they do feed them at pre-plant. And you can see a significant difference between the plants that perform well versus those that don't. Remember, if you do have excessive leaf expansion, so that you basically got all kinds of leaves, avoid fertilizing late in this production cycle. This is one of the big problems I see growers is that if it's Monday, we got to feed. Well, no, not necessarily. If you put your feed on early, do you really need to be feeding later on in the crop? If you feel that the plants are not sizing up, you may want to be looking at putting on 75 to 100 parts per million plus a micronutrient charge on a weekly basis so that you can slowly get them to size up, because putting on a huge spurt right at the end, what it does is it creates a very soft plant that then has all kinds of post-harvest problems as you go through the retail channels. So you really want to make sure that you're putting on your feed early, not late, because most of the nutrients, specifically nitrogen and phosphorus, is taken up by the roots, moved into the old foliage, then translocated later on. So as needed. So if you're basically putting it on late, you've missed the boat. So you need to get that feed on early so it gets from the roots into those old foliage so it's available to translocate as needed. Another thing to think about is putting some fertilizer on at the time of shipping so that there is retail and consumer success, because we want the consumers to be successful with what we send out to them so that they'll buy the product again because they were successful. Many times they don't get fed before they're shipped. They go into retail and they get watered but no fertilizer, and so they're starving to death, and the consumer takes them home. They water them a couple times. They put them into the ground without fertilizer, and then they just kind of linger and linger and linger. Been there, done that. And you kind of feel like, what a failure. I wasted all this money. Why should I do this again? Whereas if you have a crop that's well fertilized at the time of planting, it takes off and it grows vigorously. You think, boy, I'm a really good gardener. So let's talk about light, photoperiod, and temperature, because these are the ones that are fine-tuning. Really, the African marigolds are a late season crop is better because they really survive better at higher light conditions, keeps them more compact, gets them going. Now, low light, you do get a lot of stretching, and these can stretch because remember, you're putting a lot of phosphorus and ammonia out there to keep the other problems under control. And so that it also, you want that higher light because it accelerates flowering. These are a facultative short day plant. What that means is that the flowers are terminal. There is a juvenile phase at which photoperiod can be used to control bulking. So if you want vegetative growth in that August to March period, you want to grow them under long days, and then that will give you some size. So if you're doing them early in the season, in the spring season, you may have to have a little bit of long days on them just to get some size on them. Whereas during the April to August period, they're going to just get really, really, really big because the days in most part of the country are longer than 13 hours. If you want rapid flowering, then you basically want to have short days. Anytime the photoperiod is longer than 12 hours, so about March, it starts getting to be right around that critical 11 to 12 hours. So if you start looking at planting them in March, February, March, you may want to put some under short days so that they'll flower, they'll induce right away and they'll be saleable. And if you're doing them for the fall, you absolutely need to put them under some short days to get them to be budded up. If you don't get that photoperiod on them, they'll just get big, vegetative, and big and bulky. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of growers shy away from trying to do them for the fall, is because you do need the short days. Now, if you're doing chrysanthemums and you're doing an early chrysanthemum, this is a perfect companion crop to a short day chrysanthemum crop, because you can basically manage it very similar in your production system. Let's keep in mind also the temperatures. Marigolds do have a low base temperature. Low base temperature means at what temperatures do they not grow? Growth stops. So if you have 40 degrees, there is going to be no growth. So early in the season, if you're growing them in a really cool greenhouse, they're going to be very slow. They've got a longer crop time than a French marigold, and so therefore you really are just going to delay them, and they're going to be like bad relatives who just will not move along and just hang out with you. What we want to do is make sure we grow them warm. That's why they're much better late in the season and as a summer and fall crop, because you can keep them warm. You put a little growth rate, you put them under short days, you can get them induced, and they pretty much turn around pretty fast. And so you can have a pretty good crop time on them so that you can get the turn on them. Remember, keep the soil temperature up. These are really sensitive to low soil temperature. If they don't have low warm roots, they're just not going to take up water, they're not going to take up nutrients, and therefore they're just not going to grow. Remember, their high day temperatures, you have to kind of watch that because of the diff issue, because remember, high day, low night, plants will stretch. So really, we really look at late season for this as being much more successful than putting them early season when you're trying to push other crops into the season. Let's talk about controlling stretch. You've tried watching excess fertilization because that gives you leaf expansion. Excessively high ammonia plus phosphorus fertilizer, especially when you put it on multiple times, you're going to get leaf and stem expansion, and you're going to stretch a lot. You may want to, if you're insisting on feeding the plants, you may want to alternate with a 14-0-14, and that'll give you a little bit more promote a little more toned crop, a little bit more compact growth. But make sure that you've got that phosphorus on early, or else at the end you're going to end up with a lot of spotting. But remember, diff is your first line of control, and remember that with diff, it's the day temperature minus the night temperature that basically helps you understand how much stretch you have. Now, growers go like, well, yeah, but I don't have a $60,000 or $100,000 environmental controller to tell me all this information, to tell me what my diff is. What can I do? Well, you can do something really fancy. Is you get a day-night temperature thermometer, and every morning when the people go out to start checking their crops, they write down the day, the high, they write down the low from the previous night. And so you can kind of calculate what the day minus the night of the previous day was. And if the diff was high, that you can anticipate that the plants are going to stretch. So therefore, you have to be asking yourself, should we be putting growth regulators on these so that they're the compact and they hit the size requirements that we have? So you can use this as a tool to help you decide, should we put growth regulators on or not? So if you've got a lot of days where you've got a 20-degree positive diff, well, these are going to stretch. So therefore, you do need to put growth regulators on them. And of course, depending upon how big the plants are, will dictate which growth regulator you should use. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But you can use this as a guidepost to tell you where you are and help you decide, because these plants tend to be sold as a taller plant than most of your bedding plants. And so therefore, you really need to make sure that you're on track with hitting the right size, because too tall will be floppy, too small will not be saleable. So let's just talk about growth regulators, because most likely with this crop, you will be using growth regulators. Using diminazide or B9 is really important, especially if they're in long days and just before they go to short days. You really want to use a little diminazide, because the short days will keep them a little shorter, and the diminazide will not cause excessive compact growth. Now, If you're late season where you've got a lot of high temperatures, you got a lot of positive diff, basically using paclobutazol, bonsai, or uniconazole magic as a spray is very effective at controlling stretch so that you don't basically stomp on them. Now, the beauty of using both of these two chemicals is that they will give you greener plants because they basically both work towards holding chlorophyll and retaining chlorophyll, so the plants will appear the right color. Now, when all else fails and you find that you are hitting that 90% of the final allowable height, usually you want to, at that point, shift from a spray to a drench, because a drench is much more abrupt and it will basically stop the plants from elongating. So there are recommendations in the Grower Talks plant growth regulator handbook on using different rates for a drench. So you may want to just review that if you do need to start using a drench. So let's talk a little bit about what kind of insects do we need to be looking at. And remember, when you're monitoring for insects, always be looking above and below the bench crop. Having a card sitting 6 feet above the bench so that they're easier to see is really not very useful. You need to make sure that that card is right above the crop canopy so that you can basically catch any of the insects that are hopping up off the plants onto those cards, because they love to stick around. Ha ha ha. Underneath the bench is really critical, especially for a couple of insects where there's a soil-borne component. Thrips are a problem with this crop. Let's not kid ourselves. And the problem with thrips control is that part of the life cycle is in the soil. So this is why we need to measure underneath the bench so we can get an early indication that we've got thrips starting to come up out of the soil. So if you've got a thrips problem, especially if you're doing these late in the season, so you're doing this as a fall crop, and early in the season you had some thrips, well, I can almost guarantee that you're going to have, again, thrips late in the season, even if you had a period with nothing in the greenhouse, because the thrips are not stupid. They've survived for thousands of years by knowing that when the ground is dry, they shouldn't come out because there's nothing there. So therefore, as soon as you then bring a crop in and water the soil, guess what they say? There must be something here. And they basically come out of the pupal stage and head up into the crop and start the cycle all over again. And of course, the cycle we're concerned with is any of the tossable viruses, INSV, TSWV. So really, thrips management is about monitoring what's in the soil and treating the soil for pupa, because trying to control them once they're up in the canopy is much more complicated. Also, you want to watch out for mites. And if you've got mites wandering in, you have to ask yourself, where did they come from? Because they don't spontaneously combust. So they're around there somewhere. And you need to basically get in there and look at your mite population, where are they coming from, and control them over there. There's a number of different chemicals that you can use depending upon what's available in your particular location. Aphids are basically usually drop-ins. They're coming in from somewhere else, not so much in the spring, but when you're doing these summer fall crops, you really have to watch out for aphids, because they do spontaneously combust. If you ever experienced a drop-in of aphids, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Suddenly you go from there's nothing here to the next day of, oh my. So you really have to monitor very carefully for aphid population. From leaf spots are probably your biggest disease risk. Hungry, cold, wet plants. Probably wet plants in the fall season is more of a problem, and hungry wet is more of a problem than hungry cold. Hungry cold is more of a spring problem. Botrytis in the heads. This is why when you're doing pots, you may want to consider some sub-irrigation or drip irrigation, or very careful watering, especially once flowers are present, because those heads tend to collect water. And then if you have high relative humidity at night, which is not uncommon during the summer period, or in the winter when you've got your greenhouse closed down, you end up with botrytis in there, and you can wipe out an entire perfect crop in a matter of days, just due to incorrect relative humidity management and watering practices. If you've got a Pythium or Rhizoctonia problem in that crop, you really want to stand back and ask yourself, why are we watering incorrectly? Because these are water problems and watering conditions. You're not getting it dried down to level 2. You're basically the days between watering is too many days. 3 days is the maximum from watering to dry down. So you really need to really ask yourself what's going on in our greenhouse that's preventing us from being successful there. So, Bill, I hope that kind of gives us an overview of some of the things that are different than French marigolds and how we can handle African marigolds, because it is still the absolute queen of the marigold crop. It is the absolute most spectacular when grown well, and people absolutely love them because they bring back fond memories of them being in kindergarten when they gave their mom that marigold seed for Mother's Day. So really need to go back and ask ourselves, how can we do more African marigolds to either extend the season or just create that joy that this particular crop has? So any other comments, Bill?
I think that, well, I love African marigolds. I think they're beautiful. We actually plant them at my mother-in-law's every single year, and they tend to be absolutely beautiful. But sometimes we do get them that just don't grow.
Yep.
It sounds like, well, you've given some ideas of why that might happen and how to avoid it. I also think when you talked about African marigolds for Day of the Dead, that's something we're seeing as a huge trend right now. It's definitely a growing market and something that a lot of growers are asking about. So thank you so much for giving tips on that. And like you said, they can be a challenging crop. They're a lot longer of a crop than French marigolds, but if you follow the rules, you should be able to produce a
Yep.
beautiful crop of African marigolds. So thank you for showing this slide, because you can find dozens, if not hundreds, of tech on demand educational resources online. It's one of the things we really pride ourselves on. Every week, I send a newsletter covering a range of topics. We've created tons of videos for professionals of all skill level. You can find those on the Ball Seed YouTube channel. Tech on Demand podcast is a great way to learn about technical topics on the go. I think we have more than 150 episodes now. And if you want to connect with a global network of more than 6,000 of your peers, jump into the Greenhouse Tech Team on Facebook. It is a closed group, so you do have to ask permission to join, but all you have to do is answer a couple simple questions to prove you're a professional grower, and I will let you right in. So, Will, once again, thank you so much for your time. I know we'll talk again. We got some more finishing annuals presentations to get through, and thank you so much for your willingness to share this information with our audience.